Okay, this is about your poster presentation, and I want to show you some of these techniques that we're going to be learning for the next 3 weeks, and how to do one of them in SPSS for right now, because this is one procedure that's going to be really important to your poster presentation. So we're going to talk about ANOVA correlation and chi-square, how to determine which one you would use, and then how to compute a correlation on SPSS. So if we begin with the research question, and then we state the research hypothesis, what we know is that this person is looking for a relationship between community values and social support. And what we need to know in order to determine whether we're going to use an ANOVA, which has a qualitative variable as the IV and a quantitative variable as the DV, or correlation, which has a quantitative variable as the IV and the DV, or chi-square, which has a qualitative variable as the IV and the DV. What we need to know is what kind of variables those are. Are they qualitative variables or quantitative variables? And for that, we need to go to SPSS and look at those variables. So go to variable view. That's highlighted down there in yellow at the bottom left of the screen in your SPSS file. And then look through those variables and find the ones that pertain to what your study says you're going to analyze. So she had something in there about community health or community culture. So I see a variable called community healthy culture. And she had something in there about social support. So I see 3 variables that have to do with support. Informational support, emotional support, and encouragement, that kind of support. If you guys need help finding your particular variables from these variable names, let me know. Just email me and I'll send you the name of your variables. Also, if your background information is different or uses a different variable than you see now that you have to use the one that is associated with your background information. Don't redo your background information. Find the variable that you need in this variable list. So go back down there and go to data view now so that we can look at these variables and see what kind of numbers they are, whether they're qualitative or quantitative numbers. You can tell from looking at them that they're quantitative numbers. 3.6, 4.67, those are quantities, and the numbers matter. So we have 2 quantitative variables that we're interested in, but the support, the social support variable, we actually have 3 of them, so we need to pick one. And if we have a quantitative independent variable, community values, and a quantitative dependent variable, social support, we need to use a procedure called correlation. The null hypothesis for a correlation statistic, testing that statistic, is that rho, that looks like a P, but really it's a Greek R, because remember parameters are labeled in Greek letters. The null hypothesis is that the correlation, the population correlation rho, is equal to 0. And we're going to have to test that. Before we analyze, let's look at the variables or the particular items that go into those variables. So if you go to variable view and look at the label column, you'll see that I computed community healthy culture, the variable I call community healthy culture, by forming an average of several items. And I computed the variable support information that I call support information by computing an average of 3 items. So if you go back to data view and you hover over question 20, number 1_1, it says label your thoughts on the norms and values and health in your community and choose your level of agreement with. It's normal for people in my community to have a disease like diabetes. So if I look at the scores associated with that question, I can see that those scores range from 1 to 7. And that tells me that I'm using a Likert scale where people are agreeing or disagreeing with that statement. And the scores range from 1 to 7. This is not something you have to do, but it's something I had to do before I created the community healthy culture variable. So here are the 5 items that correspond to community healthy culture. Some of them, though, if you get a high score on it, like it's normal for people to have diabetes in my community, then really that's a lower score on healthy culture. So if you look, those are coded, but there's some math behind it. Like the question is multiplied by -1. So I'm reverse coding those. Having diabetes as being a part or a member of my community. I had to reverse code that. So now we have a variable where all of the questions, if you get a high score, that means you're saying that you have a healthy culture. So for community healthy culture, high scores mean a more healthy culture. For this variable informational support, all of the questions are asked so that if you say yes and you get a high score, you have more informational support. So we just find the average of those scores. And this information would go into your methods section. Part of what you don't know, but you need to, is that this study, all of your sections of this study were part of a larger study that was a needs assessment concerning healthy ways in the Deep South. And this sample in particular had only people from the Deep South who were 30 years of age and older. That needs to be in your methods section. Also, give examples of the types of items you analyzed, the types of items that went into your variables. Finding the correlation between community healthy values and social support in the form of information is really easy. We're just going to go to Analyze, Correlate, Bivariate. Find your variables in the menu, and if your variables are towards the end of the data set, then your variables will be towards the end of the menu. Put your variables in the menu box and then hit OK. Check to make sure that you have the right variables. And look at the correlation output. So we ran a Pearson's correlation between these two variables. Pearson's correlation, we're going to talk about that next week. It gets at the relationship between two quantitative variables. So like usually height and shoe size are correlated because taller people have larger feet generally. So this is saying, and correlations can be positive or negative. If taller people had shorter feet, then the correlation would be negative, but this is a positive correlation. So Pearson's correlation is equal to 0.146. The largest it can get is 1. The smallest it can get is -1. We'll talk about that next week. But you got a correlation of 0.146 between these two variables. That sig value right there is actually a p-value, and a p-value is the probability of getting your result or something more extreme with a true null. So you compare that to 0.05, and if p is less than 0.05, if p is less than alpha, Then you reject the null hypothesis that rho is equal to 0. So here we had 211 people, pairs of scores. We got a Pearson's correlation of 0.146, and it was significant. So here we are. We began with a research question: is there a relationship between community values and social support for health for people in the Deep South who are over 30 years of age? We stated our research hypothesis. We figured out that we needed to use correlation to test the null because we had two quantitative variables. We tested the null. We got an R of 0.146, and with N equals 211, P was 0.035, and that's less than 0.05, so we rejected the null. And we formed our conclusion. There's a significant positive relation between community values for health and social support in the form of providing information for people in the Deep South over 30 years of age. We can turn that into a short results section. And add it on to what we've already done in our already designed poster. We have a rough draft of our introduction. We have tables already designed. In the conclusion section, we can talk about why our findings are important. What does that mean for intervention studies in the Deep South? How can we affect change even better now that we know that there's a relationship between community values and social support in the form of information? Make sure to look at those example posters and see how they handle conclusions, how they handled abstract. The abstract is going to be a couple of sentences about the entire study. I was looking for this, I found this. It's important because of this. Look at all those posters. You have about 15 posters to look at to get some ideas about how you can handle these different sections. So remember, on the first day of class, we learned about soft skills and hard skills that companies need most in order to be successful. And we talked about how this project was a project in collaboration and adaptability. I mean, we're all being adaptable by adapting to this COVID environment. And persuasion and creativity. The design of the poster is an exercise in creativity. And we talked about hard skills like analytical reasoning. Every aspect of this poster is an exercise in analytical reading. So we are, through this poster, through your presentation as well. Your presentation of this poster is an exercise in persuasion. Convince us that this is an important topic. It needs to be studied. And by the way, it can make a difference in health disparities. We're learning about how to apply stats to the real world, to any job you'll ever have. These soft skills apply to all your jobs. These hard skills, they want you to be able to reason analytically. These are all exercises in what you're going to need in whatever job you take in your life.